I always thought horror stories about nightmares were exaggerated. Until the morning I found a neon orange envelope flapping against the side of my boat like some sort of bright, taunting flag. I wasn't parked illegally. I wasn't blocking a street. I wasn't even anywhere close to community property. My boat was tied up neatly to a dock that had been standing strong for decades. A dock my grandfather had built with his bare hands, long before the first paved road ever led into this area. The wind was just right that morning, carrying the faint sounds of loons across the water. But all I could hear was the crinkling sound of that ugly notice as I ripped it off and stared at the words printed in bold capital letters. Violation notice. Unauthorized watercraft. Remove within 48 hours or face escalating penalties and removal. I read it once, then again, each time more baffled than the last. Because this boat wasn't parked on some random lake. This wasn't public property. This wasn't even a shared community space. This was my boat, floating peacefully on my lake, tied to a dock on my land. Every single plank, every ripple of water, every rock on the shore was under my family's name, legally and permanently. At first, I genuinely thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe someone got their wires crossed. Maybe a new neighbor didn't know better. Maybe, just maybe, some intern at the HOA office slapped the wrong address on the wrong notice. But as I read further, that hope quickly faded. The letter wasn't apologetic. It wasn't cautious. It was smug. It was dripping with the self-importance of someone who thought a clipboard and a laminated badge made them king of the world. The language was stiff and formal, the kind that tries too hard to sound official and just ends up making you roll your eyes. They quoted community standards, visual compliance, and warned that unauthorized usage would not be tolerated. Tolerated on my own property. The absurdity of it hit me like a slap. I could almost picture whoever wrote this, sitting behind a faux wood desk with a self-satisfied grin, thinking they were laying down the law. What they didn't realize, what they didn't even bother to check, was that they weren't just threatening another resident. They were trying to bully the owner of the very lake they were pretending to govern. And in that moment, standing there barefoot on the weathered dock with the morning sun reflecting off the calm water, I made a decision. I wasn't just going to ignore this. I wasn't going to let it slide. They wanted a fight. I'd give them a war they wouldn't forget. The first time I heard about Valerie Mitchell, it wasn't through official HOA channels or neighborly introductions. It was whispered like a warning, usually with an eye roll or a groan, and always followed by the nickname everyone around here used, Karen. She was infamous, the kind of person who weaponized the rule book to settle personal grudges, the type who would measure the height of your lawn with a ruler and report you for being half an inch over regulation. Everyone knew a Karen but ours. Ours was in a league of her own. Valerie didn't just enforce the rules, she lived for them. She didn't just complain, she documented. Color-coded files, photographs, spreadsheets. Rumor had it she had a literal database of violations, sorted by street and severity. She was the self-declared queen of compliance, and the HOA board was her royal court. If something didn't fit her vision of suburban perfection, it had to go. She didn't just want order, she wanted control. Total, unquestioned control. Until that day, I'd managed to fly under her radar. My cabin was tucked back among the trees, away from the manicured cul-de-sacs and the pressure-washed sidewalks. I lived quietly, kept to myself, spent my mornings fishing and my afternoons fixing up the old place. But peace has a funny way of drawing the attention of people who thrive on chaos. Maybe she saw my old boat and decided it was an eyesore. Maybe she didn't like that I hadn't painted my dock in the approved shade of beige. Maybe she simply couldn't stand the fact that there was something in her kingdom she didn't fully control. Whatever the reason, Karen had found me. And judging by the tone of that violation notice, she was itching for a confrontation. What she didn't realize, though, was that she wasn't just picking a fight with another homeowner who'd grumble and eventually cave. She was poking a bear that had been raised by a man who believed fiercely in the right to stand your ground. A man who had drilled into me since childhood that you don't back down when someone tries to take what's yours. Karen didn't know it yet, but she had just made the worst mistake of her reign. I sat down on the dock, the violation notice still in my hand, reading it again as the absurdity truly sank in. It wasn't just the threat of fines that amused me. It was the total, blind confidence in her authority. The smug assurance that a piece of paper taped to my boat would somehow bend me to her will. The way they tossed around phrases like community waters, as if simply declaring it made it true. The whole thing was so delusional it was almost impressive. I could almost hear the clack of her keyboard as she typed it up, sipping on lukewarm coffee and adjusting the angle of her neatly organized pens. Probably thought she was saving the neighborhood from another monstrous violation, another affront to her vision of pristine, Stepford-perfect suburbia. What she didn't realize was that the lake she was so eager to govern wasn't part of her little fiefdom. It didn't belong to the HOA. It didn't belong to the community. It didn't belong to the county. It belonged to me, fully, legally, unquestionably. My grandfather had bought this entire property, cabin, land, dock, lake and all, back in a time when no one wanted it, back when the area was considered too remote, too wild, too rugged. He believed in building things that lasted. He believed in protecting what you loved, even if it wasn't fashionable, even if no one else saw the value. That belief was written into the deeds, into the surveys, into every scrap of legal documentation carefully preserved in a dusty old filing box inside the cabin. Karen hadn't bothered to look. She hadn't bothered to check. She just assumed authority because that's what people like her do. They think rules they invent are more powerful than the truth. But in my world, facts still mattered. Ownership still mattered. And respect. That was something you earned, not demanded. They wanted to play games. Fine, I'd play. But I wasn't just going to beat them at their own game. I was going to flip the whole board over and make sure Karen never forgot who really owned this lake. The funny thing about people who think they're in charge is they usually leave footprints. Little signs of their arrogance they never expect anyone to look for. That's exactly what I found when I decided to start digging into Karen's empire. I wasn't just curious anymore. I was furious. Furious enough to roll up my sleeves and find out just how deep this rabbit hole went. I started simple, searching the HOA's public website, and right there, plain as day, was a glossy slideshow titled Community Highlights. Page after page of smiling families, kids running along the shore, gleaming fishing boats lined up at a dock. My dock. They didn't even try to hide it. My shoreline, my trees, my land, all casually displayed like it was their private resort. They posted photos of tournaments, barbecues, fishing contests, all staged right there on my lake. It wasn't just an occasional slip-up either. They had schedules posted, summer tournaments, fall cookouts, 4th of July fireworks. They had the audacity to advertise annual memberships, granting lake access privileges. They weren't just playing pretend rulers. They were profiting off my property without so much as a phone call, a letter, a knock on my door. The more I looked, the more outrageous it got. They had event sponsors. They sold merchandise. They even had a junior anglers program, complete with colourful t-shirts and banners planted right in front of the old willow tree my grandfather planted back in the 50s. They threw tournaments with names like the Great Maple Shores Showdown, acting like they were ESPN commentators instead of a bunch of weekend warriors fumbling with tackle boxes. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't an innocent mistake. This was deliberate, systematic. Entitlement layered over entitlement. They weren't just breaking the rules. They were writing their own, scribbling over the truth, and cashing in on the idea that no one would ever call them out. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen, feeling something shift deep inside me. It wasn't just about the boat anymore. It wasn't even about the lake. It was about standing up to the kind of people who thought they could take whatever they wanted, and worse, believed they were doing you a favor by doing it. I wasn't about to let that stand. It wasn't enough to be angry. It wasn't enough to just know what they were doing. If I was going to take them down, I needed more than outrage. I needed facts. I needed evidence. I needed to hit them where it hurt the most, in the cold, hard reality of legal ownership. That's when I called Emma. We went to college together, and while most of us barely survived finals week, she thrived on it. She was brilliant, relentless, and just the right kind of mean when it came to legal battles. She picked up on the second ring, and when I told her the whole story, she didn't laugh this time. She got quiet. "You need to document everything," she said. "Screenshots, photos, emails, anything you can find, before they realize you're onto them and start scrubbing it all." She told me to install discreet cameras around the shoreline, places where the tournaments were happening. "We're not just looking for trespassing anymore," she said. "Depending on what they've been charging, how they've advertised it, we might be looking at fraud, maybe even criminal charges." I hung up with a strange sense of calm, like the first click of a chess piece, when you know the other side is already cornered and just doesn't realize it yet. That night, while the frogs sang by the shoreline and the moon laid a silver path across the water, I set up cameras under the cover of darkness, motion activated, high resolution, carefully placed among the old trees and weathered rocks. I didn't just want to catch them using the lake. I wanted to catch them bragging about it. I dug through every drawer and cabinet in the cabin until I found the old filing box my father had left me, a dusty treasure chest of every deed, every survey, every legal document tied to the property. My hands shook slightly as I flipped through the yellowed pages. There it was, clear as day, my grandfather's name, my father's, mine. No easements, no shared rights, no mention of any community oversight. The lake bed, the shoreline, even 15 feet beyond the water's edge, all of it was ours, not the HOA's, not Karen's, not anybody else's. I sat back, the weight of it all hitting me at once. They thought they were playing a game of neighborhood politics. They thought they could scare me with threats and notices. They didn't realize they were trespassing on sacred ground, something built and protected by 3 generations of my family. The timing couldn't have been better. The next HOA meeting was just a few days away. Normally I wouldn't have given it a second thought, but this time I circled it on my calendar in thick black marker. I wasn't going to raise my voice. I wasn't going to storm in waving papers. No, that's what they'd expect. Instead, I was going to do something far worse. I was going to ask questions. Polite questions. Innocent questions. The kind of questions that peel away the lies one layer at a time, until there's nothing left but the ugly truth underneath. The Maple Shores Community Hall was exactly what you'd expect. A sad little building that tried way too hard to look important. Fake columns, peeling paint, a fountain out front that hadn't worked in years. I pulled into the gravel lot, just as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows over the rows of parked SUVs. Inside, the smell of burnt coffee and lemon-scented floor cleaner hit me like a wall. Rows of metal folding chairs were lined up facing a long table, where the HOA board sat like a lineup of small-town politicians, waiting for their 15 minutes of relevance. Richard Wilkins, the HOA president, was at the center of it all, hair slicked back, blazer too tight across his chest, fiddling with a stack of papers like he was preparing to deliver the State of the Union. And there, right beside him, was Karen herself. Clipboard clutched like a weapon, lips pursed so tightly they disappeared into her face. The meeting was the usual slog at first. lawn maintenance standards, fence painting guidelines, pet leash reminders. You could practically feel the life draining out of the room. People nodded absently, flipping through the printed agendas with dead-eyed boredom. It was all so tedious, until Richard cleared his throat and said, "We've received reports of an unauthorized watercraft being moored on community waters. We want to remind all residents that proper registration and visual compliance is required at all times." His voice was the perfect mix of condescension and false concern, like he was talking to a group of naughty children. He even paused dramatically, scanning the room as if expecting applause. That's when I raised my hand. Just one hand, slow and casual. You could feel the ripple of curiosity as heads turned. Richard blinked, caught off guard. Clearly this wasn't part of his script, but after a second, he forced a smile and nodded. "Yes, sir, in the back." I stood up slowly, hands in my pockets, voice steady and light. "Just a quick question about the lake," I said. "When you say community waters, who exactly owns the lake?" "The HOA, the county. Some private party." For a split second, Richard's polished smile faltered. Karen stiffened in her chair, eyes narrowing to slits. You could feel the tension thicken, like someone had just snapped a rubber band in the middle of the room. Richard coughed, adjusting his glasses unnecessarily. "Well," he started, "there are long-standing historical arrangements in place. The HOA maintains full authority over the management and visual standards of the lake, which—" "But the ownership," I interrupted, keeping my tone light, curious, almost naive. "Who owns it? Not the management. The actual deed. The legal title." He floundered for a moment, looking down at his papers like the answer might have magically appeared there. "The HOA represents the community's interests," he said finally, sounding less sure of himself by the second. "Right," I said, nodding thoughtfully. "Just wondering because I live on the East Shore. My grandfather bought that land in the 50s. Been in the family ever since. Name's still on the deed." Silence. A thick, heavy silence, broken only by the squeak of someone shifting uncomfortably in their chair. Karen was shooting daggers at me with her eyes, but I didn't even flinch. I just smiled politely and sat back down, letting the awkwardness fester and spread like a slow-moving wildfire. The meeting wrapped up quickly after that. No more confident speeches. No more smug announcements. People whispered in small groups, stealing glances at me as they left, their faces a mixture of curiosity, confusion, and dawning suspicion. I didn't need to cause a scene. I didn't need to shout or wave documents in anyone's face. All I had to do was ask the right questions, because now the seed of doubt was planted. Now they were wondering. Now Karen and Richard were scrambling. And me, I was just getting started. You ever have one of those moments where you know something's wrong before you even see it? Before your brain can piece it together, your gut already knows. That's exactly what hit me the second I turned the corner and saw the empty space where my boat used to be. It felt like a punch right to the ribs, sharp and sudden. The dock rope was still there, tied neatly to the cleat, swinging slightly in the breeze like a cruel joke. But the boat, gone. Just gone. For a moment, I thought maybe it had come loose, drifted off somehow. But no, not my boat. Not the way I tied it. Not after all the care I took every time I docked it. That's when I saw it. Another neon orange violation notice pinned under a rock on the dock bench, fluttering like some cheap flag of conquest. I snatched it up, and my hands trembled, not with fear, but with something colder, something sharper. According to the notice, my boat had been removed for non-compliance and was now being held pending a $750 fine and my agreement to abide by all HOA lake regulations moving forward. They didn't just fine me. They didn't just threaten me. They stole from me. They walked onto my property, uninvited, and took my boat like it was some abandoned bicycle left on the sidewalk. That wasn't just bold. That wasn't just entitled. That was a declaration of war. I stood there for a long moment, breathing slow, staring out at the calm water, feeling the weight of what just happened settle into my bones. They thought they could push me around. They thought I was just another resident who would grumble, pay the fine, and get in line. They thought wrong. I pulled out my phone and called the sheriff's department, laying it all out as calmly as I could. But the deputy who answered didn't seem eager to help. He called it a civil matter, a property dispute, and said I should try working it out with the HOA first, before involving law enforcement. I asked him point blank, did the HOA have any legal jurisdiction over my land? Over my boat? Over the lake? He paused, then mumbled something about grey areas and historical usage agreements, before admitting reluctantly that it wasn't exactly clear. That was all I needed to hear. They weren't just wrong morally, they were wrong legally. They didn't have a leg to stand on, and now I had every reason and every right to bring their little empire crashing down. The morning of the big tournament was the kind of perfect blue sky day that almost makes you forget how dirty people can be. Almost. I sat on my porch, mug of coffee in hand, watching the spectacle unfold through a pair of old binoculars. One after another, trucks and SUVs rolled up along the eastern shoreline, the shoreline that was, by every legal document in my possession, my private property. Boat trailers backed down into the water like it was a public launch site. Men in fishing vests strutted around barking orders into walkie-talkies. Kids darted between tents as folding tables were set up, coolers cracked open, grills fired up. They weren't just trespassing, they were flaunting it, acting like they owned the place, acting like I was the intruder. And right at the center of it all, like a proud general surveying his troops, was Gerald Thompson, the president of the so-called Elite Anglers Club. Clipboard tucked under one arm, barking out orders, laughing, slapping backs, waving people into designated parking areas carved straight into my grass. But they weren't the only ones who showed up that morning. Around noon, a new group arrived, dressed not in fishing vests, but in polished shoes and tailored suits. The investors. The ones Richard and Karen had been buttering up behind the scenes. They milled around the tents, shook hands with Gerald and Richard, peered out at the lake with predatory eyes, like they could already see the rows of private docks and luxury condos they were planning to carve out of my family's legacy. I could even catch bits of Richard's grand tour through the binoculars, his voice practically dripping with false charm as he described the exclusive community lake access and long-standing HOA stewardship. It was surreal, watching them sell a dream built on lies, standing on land they didn't own, over water that wasn't theirs. But today wasn't just about watching. Today was about ending it. Emma arrived just after noon, cool and composed as always, a file folder tucked under one arm and a folded court order in her hand. She gave me a nod, and we walked down together, side by side, unhurried, steady, right into the heart of their little fantasy. The deputy sheriff Emma had arranged to meet us was already waiting, badge gleaming in the sun, looking every bit like the authority we needed. We didn't need to raise our voices. We didn't need to cause a scene. The moment Emma unrolled that court order and started reading aloud, it was like dropping a grenade into a crowded room. Confusion rippled across the crowd. Heads turned. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Gerald stormed over first, face red, sputtering about tradition and community standards, trying to bluster his way through it. Emma shut him down with surgical precision, laying out the facts. The lake was privately owned, had always been privately owned, and every event they had ever held was unauthorized trespassing. Richard stumbled over, still clinging to his fake charm, trying to smooth things over, trying to spin the story to the investors who were now eyeing him like a used car salesman, caught rolling back odometers. Emma handed him a second document, a cease and desist, barring any further misrepresentation of lake ownership to potential buyers. The sheriff stepped forward, voice calm but firm, and told the crowd they were now trespassing and needed to vacate immediately. Some people looked confused, some looked angry. Most just looked scared, realizing for the first time that they had been lied to, used, dragged into something that could have real consequences. Tents collapsed. Grills were doused. Boats were hastily hauled out of the water. Within 30 minutes, the shoreline was empty again, stripped of its fake banners, its folding tables, its flimsy illusions of control. Karen didn't go quietly. No. She cornered me near the dock, face twisted in rage, jabbing a perfectly manicured finger at my chest as she launched into a tirade about ruining everything and sabotaging the community's future. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The truth was already louder than anything she could scream. And in that moment, as she realized she had lost, not just the lake, not just the tournament, but her entire little kingdom, there was a flicker of something almost like fear in her eyes. She knew it was over. In the days that followed, everything unraveled for them. Richard resigned from the HOA by email, slinking away without even facing the residents he had deceived. Karen vanished from the newsletter, from the social committees, from the community events she once ruled with an iron clipboard. Residents started asking hard questions. Where had their dues gone? Why had they been told they owned access to something they didn't? Why had they been lied to for so long? And the local news caught wind of the story too, thanks to a few well-placed tips from Emma. The headlines were brutal. HOA exposed for lake fraud. Fake authority leads to legal firestorm. Community betrayed by its own leaders. The fallout was swift and merciless. But for me, the real victory wasn't just seeing Karen and Richard fall. It was in what came next. Working with the new humbled HOA board and a team of lawyers, we created the Sullivan Lake Conservation Trust, a non-profit dedicated to protecting the lake, preserving its beauty, and offering limited, respectful access to residents who truly appreciated it. No more tournaments, no more power trips, no more secret deals. Just a simple, sacred place, guarded by the same values my grandfather had lived by. Every year, we issue a handful of permits for fishing and kayaking, with every penny going back into conservation efforts. And the Elite Anglers Club? It's gone. Replaced by a small, humble fishing community that meets quietly, respectfully, always remembering whose land they're blessed to share. My boat was returned too, battered but intact, along with a pitiful apology note signed by the acting HOA president. I didn't need their apology. The lake was quiet again, the water was clear, and every morning, when I push off from the dock and watch the sun rise over Sullivan Lake, I know exactly what we fought for. Legacy, responsibility, honor, and the unshakable truth that sometimes standing your ground isn't just about keeping what's yours. It's about making sure the ones who come after you never have to fight the same battle again.